Thank you, Elliot, and thank you all. The way that we'll use our remaining time on this panel is we will talk. I'm turning everyone from speakers into discussants for about 10 minutes, and then we will open the floor for Q&A with all of you for half an hour to end. So my first question to all of you is just an immediate gut reaction. What did you just hear here that surprised you or that resonated with you across the different talks?
I'll start. One of the things that really resonated with me are the stories from the medical space and how little empathy I saw in some of the stories that were shared. When I think about physicians, it's like bedside manners and, empathy should be such a big part of what physicians do. And I was really struck by that. And that got me thinking, how do we bridge that gap? How are we training physicians? How are we training scientists to have empathy? That's something that really stayed with me.
Yeah, Johanna.
Can I veer off from the topic, but just to respond to what Monica is saying, in 8 minutes, there were a lot of generalizations in my talk that were not really fair to physicians who are very well attuned to empathy. But what I would say is that when training and desire for empathy bump into opposition that seems ridiculous, it's very easy for the empathy to fall out. So I hope that nuances a little bit what I was trying to get at.
There's an excellent essay that's just been published in academic medicine called Can a Woman of Color Trust Medical Training, talking about what it was like to be a doctor in training herself, wanting to be the physician that her community didn't have, and how she noticed her own empathy and attitudes shifting over time under the pressure. Yeah. What else?
I think one thing, a lot of our discussion so far today has talked about this domain of scientific expertise, and then how do we get that out? And I think what we've heard from a lot of speakers is that there is also this domain of storytelling expertise. Yes, we all have stories, but there's a lot of bad stories. And a lot of the choices that go into what it takes to make a good story, that's a whole nother domain of expertise. And we hope they overlap, but it's more complicated than just saying, oh, go over and tell a story, or the other direction, oh, just pull in some science. We've got two different types of expertise.
If I could say, I learned so much from every speaker, but two things in particular stuck with me. One is just the idea of just, and maybe it's because I work in a medical context, but physicians these days pretty much have negative time. They don't have time to do anything. And I often see their very limited time spent in very factually based presentations about, well, let me explain to you what happens when your kidneys are failing. And then there's this long explanation. The patient is no wiser. Their time has been lost. And then they're very frustrated that the patient still doesn't know what to choose. Should I go on dialysis or not? And I realized in listening to the talk on GIST what a great concept that would be in a medical setting, because it gets to the heart. It gets to what does this mean, which is a question that patients and family members really want answered. And sometimes scientists or doctors, which I know some people don't think they're scientists, but whatever, in that middle range, but they're not as good at getting to the heart of the matter. So I did like that. And then the other thing that I heard from Monica, which just really inspired me kind of to reshape my own thinking, is the idea that diversity in science and medicine, all the great contributions that will come of that are not in spite of, but because of that very diversity. And I think certainly in the medical school context, we're very guilty of endorsing many of the myths that you've said, and I just loved seeing that exploded. So thanks.
Connecting, earlier panel with this, still on the topic of empathy. It's an agonizing question. To what degree is being empathic play acting, pretending, performing a role? Are you suspending your training and view of what the truth is in order to put yourself in the place of someone whose place you would not want to be into because you know it's disconnected from the facts. So I completely respect and understand and why one should be humble and respectful. But I'm just wondering, to what degree is there a performance aspect of that which is counter to one's training and one's view of what scientific truth is?
Yeah, and what I find is really interesting in the work that I was talking about before about narrative transportation, you can't help it. You know, we've all had those moments of you're in a movie theater and the time is passing, you're reading a book and you can't hear someone calling your name. When people are deeply transported into a narrative world, they're actively thinking about the motivations and the what's that character doing and why and what's going to happen next. And it's not this deliberate sort of ego-centered, willful, I'm now going to think about this character. It's like you almost can't help it, which I find very powerful and, you know, dangerous as well. Anything else you want to talk about?
I mean, I guess for me, I think this idea of diversity as just not a separate panel, not a separate discussion or breakout, but just central to the entire endeavor. That if the goal of science is to describe the world, then we have to make it the entire world, and we have to make sure that that is baked into it's not something that is added on once the system is already built, but that the systems that produce the stories take that as a sort of as one of the many necessary, but a founding principle.
And just to connect that to the comment about empathy, you know, it's very hard to imagine what it would be like to not know what you know. Right? We do this all the time when we're teachers. You know, the math teacher really understands math. But remember, we were all there once. We were once a student who didn't know. Even the math teacher wasn't born knowing math. So it's really a very effortful thing. There's individual differences and there's scales for this, cognitive and affective empathy scales. So some people are better able to put themselves in the position of someone else. But part of why we were able to do some of the interventions we did is we said, okay, what's the gist according to the experts? Then work backwards to what would you have to know to get that? Right? And it turns out it's not an infinite number of things. It's that you have to know, if I was coming from that person's place, what would I think? And again, we were all there once. There was a time we didn't know.
I've asked our discussants to each think about final words of wisdom, and I'm going to challenge you to say, in a tweet's length, what is the one thing that you want this audience to remember or take away from what you've said here today? I'll start at the end with you.
So we knew this was coming, which is why we're prepared. Storytelling reveals the humanity surrounding science.
Entertainment is dangerous and wonderful.
Boy, it's hard to follow these people. You're so good, and you're so good. Really, all of it resonated. I would say that narrative, just like icon arrays or all of these things people think are panaceas, they're not all equal. There are narratives that can explain and give you insight, and there's ones that don't. And obviously, we want the ones that explain and give insight.
I'd actually like to challenge the audience to think about, you started saying that stories inspire us and animate us. And what I would like all of us to think about is how can we take that inspiration that these stories causes or like brings up on us and actually pair it with action so that we create the changes that we want to see.
I would say that narrative is about listening as much as telling, and to be careful not to judge too quickly.
I would say we think we know what the audience wants and what the public wants as far as science storytelling, but if we try new things, we might be surprised by what we find.
And I would say stories have power. A microphone is power, a stage is power. And when we think about the stories we tell to ourselves, about our science, to the broader world, I hope that we're as thoughtful and creative and experimental and rigorous in those things as we are in the science that we hope to communicate. So now we'll turn it over to you. We have microphone runners. Please identify yourself and make sure you're asking a question. And there's a...
I asked a question before and I didn't identify myself, so this time I will. I'm Penny Noyce. I'm a publisher of children's books about science. And my question is, we've talked about narrative, but we haven't talked about the place of fiction. And especially for kids, I wonder how you think about fiction being true in the way that narrative is true as it concerns science.
I'll describe the most popular Disney family show in its umpteenth season. It's called Doc McStuffins, and it's about a daughter of an African-American doctor, and the daughter plays doctor to her stuffed animals. And it's all about medicine and science and diversity. It's a completely made-up world, but it's also true to a world that we want to see exist.
I think one other thing I'll throw out is we talked about how within storytelling, truth is within the story. And there's a number of studies and a meta-analysis that finds there is really no difference between fictional and non-fictional stories, the effect that they have on people. Even if you tell them, this is a fictional story, and then you measure the attitude change, you measure things at the end, over multiple studies, they're the same stories.
I just wanted to add, I forgot to mention the number of African-American women going into medicine has surged, and when people have tried to find out why, that show's name comes up more than anything else.
You have to talk into the top.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Vanessa Bodwins from RTI International. And I was thinking about when we share news stories online, they're often accompanied with a photo. And that photo can certainly tell a story. And it can tell two very different stories depending on the source and how they use it. And Valerie, when you were talking, I thought sometimes photos also get at that gist you were getting at. And that can be dangerous in some instances, but it also could be used to our advantage. And I think about some of the science communication that comes out, and I see a lot of pictures of neurons or people in labs, whereas the other images from maybe inaccurate sources, they really have really compelling images. So I wonder if you all could speak to, knowing what you know about storytelling, how can we apply that to still images to help us choose pictures that are engaging but not misleading?
It reminds me of research that we once did with specifically language impaired students, and how we told them stories with pictures and showed that they didn't, their thought was that they had an inferential problem. They couldn't make inferences. And they made inferences just fine if you didn't express it verbally. So it really was a specific language impairment. So pictures really can compel a story. You have to be careful that the cultural references and so on in the story, there's a lot of reading into all of this, whether it's a picture or words or numbers. You bring your background knowledge and you fill in. So you've got to make sure that that's a shared background knowledge, or it's sufficiently outlined so that people can get what's in the story. But often, you know, these scientific websites or government websites are very pallid. They don't have stories. They don't even say why they're telling you what they're telling you. Like, what is the point of the information? And the contrast with folks sometimes who are maybe not so pro-science is stark. You know, there's an anecdote, there's a compelling story, there's emotion, there's a point. There's pictures, and they're vivid. So all of that, if you notice, for example, that in that study that I showed you, images had its own effect, even controlling for gist and story and so on. So all of that together, when you can get that to be synergistic, I think that can be very effective.
I would add too that make sure that the people that are judging these pictures are diverse themselves and that are coming from different backgrounds, because you can have seen many times where people have a blind spot to what is depicting something, and it's there because everybody's bringing their own cultural and background to it, and just to make sure that doesn't get transferred in the way that that's being portrayed to the public.
Yeah, and just to elaborate on that point, I was just thinking last week a group of medical students, as part of a project they did, designed a really great brochure about pediatric dental health. And in contrast to a lot of the brochures that are more government produced, this had beautiful graphics and cool type font, and it was really great brochure. The clinic for which it was designed has a population that's 75% Latino and Spanish speaking. And all the pictures in the brochure were of adorable little white kids. And so again, the power of the visual was vitiated by just kind of a lack of cultural awareness, yeah.
And I'll just quickly add to that. It's not just like pictures of people or of something, but also infographics. I recently saw an instance in which an organization used owls to depict something related to an event that they were doing, and a large portion of their audience is Native American, and in certain Native American cultures, owls mean, I think it means death. I don't remember what it means, but there's a negative connotation, and they completely miss that. And so not just think about pictures, but also all sorts of imagery that you're using.
Hi, my name is Dara Wald. I'm at Iowa State University, and I was hoping, since all of you guys spend a lot more time in the world of narratives than I do, what do you think we don't know yet about the power of narratives? And I'm really interested in empathy as well. So yeah, what do we not know about the power of narratives and the power of empathy?
So I'll say one thing. I think if you look at a lot of the literature, we've got these broad psychological variables. So we know pretty well if a narrative transports you, there's some measures to see how much your mind is within the story, that leads to larger effects. We know identification. If you identify with characters in the narrative, again, that leads to larger effects. So there's questions, but that's more well known. What I'd call the craft level variables, how do you actually create a story that leads to more transportation? How do you create it that leads? As we've seen, there's so many choices that go into that. I mean, there are studies that are trying to pick apart at that, but it's going to take a very long time. It's still this craft level of, I aspire to achieve these psychological effects, and how to do that is an open question.
Go ahead.
No, you go. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to go. Okay. Yeah, so I wanted to pick up both on something you said about the performative aspect of empathy and also what we don't know about narrative. I mean, I think that there's also a moral issue involved here. And, we heard in one of the morning panels about the distinction between education and persuasion. And I think that that was a fabulous point. And in fact, education is rarely, if ever, neutral. There is an intended effect, and the intended effect is most often persuasion. But I think that in dissecting the power of narrative, like Liz has referred to, we also really have to think about the line between persuasion and coercion or manipulation, and whether simply because the end is good is manipulation through like a really good story, is that always justified? And I think it has to do with, are we performing empathy, or do we really experience it and feel it?
Yeah, and by the way, I think everything people have said about this is so instructive, and you really, that's, when you said, did something sort of surprise you, that part about the tea surprised me, but I can see your point, I should say that we shouldn't totally give up on doctors really being frustrated that patients are not compliant, because you don't want people to give up on patients. It's easy to be lazy. It's easy to say, well, they're not listening, go on to the next one, I don't care. Let them take the tea and maybe they'll have amputations and blindness. But, it is, they're overwhelmed, they have a lot to do. So you want to continue to have that striving that we stress so much in doctors. But in order to achieve that goal, going straight on with people and not appreciating where they're coming from and why they're saying what they're saying is not going to accomplish that goal. So you want to have both. You want to keep that inner frustration still there because you want them to continue to work with the patient and try to change the outcome.
Yeah.
I just want to pick up a little bit about this idea of just how the craft itself. And I just, I think it's a very hard thing to study. And a lot of, like what is art? Like what moves you? And I think that there's a lot that we just don't even know about that. But I think it's worth trying to study. And I just think that the sample sizes are really, really small. And that new inspirations or a new thing can come that changes everything. You could argue that the advent of Netflix changed a lot of what was possible. The advent of YouTube changed a lot of what was possible. Before The Sopranos, there was all sorts of assumptions about what a TV drama should be. And then afterwards, there was a whole set of different assumptions about what a TV drama should be. And I would argue that in the sciences, especially in video, in film, which is a very persuasive medium, there's just the number of films that are done are just very, very small. And so I think we don't really know yet until we start putting it out and trying different feedback and testing the feedback and also testing the distribution, that we don't really know what the impact can be.
And I think one more I'd like to build off of that. So you're talking about the goals, and we saw from a slide earlier today, there were 5 goals of science communication. And we know quite a bit about persuasion. The field of narrative persuasion pretty much focuses on that. We have science education that looks a lot at knowledge. So a lot of these goals are looked at with respect to narrative. But the one, I think was the very first one, this idea of sharing the excitement of science, sharing the wonder and the awe, to inspire. These words come up very often as goals, but there's really not that much research trying to see what happens when people are awe-inspired. What outcomes does that lead to? What are the types of messages that lead to that? So I think that gets brought up a lot, and I think it's a wonderful goal, but it's also something we don't know that much about empirically.
Hi, I'm Julia Kiernan from Kettering University, and I teach primarily undergraduate science students, and I teach from a communications background, so I am trying to integrate storytelling into the classrooms, and there's a huge pushback from students. And I think part of it is what you are, of course, from everyone, but storytelling is practice. People are not just good storytellers, they practice again and again and again. And we do this all the time when we tell a story and it gets a good reaction, then we tell it again and we tell it again. It becomes our dinner party story. But I'm wondering from you all, where is this going to happen for our emerging science students? So if I do that in my humanities class, great. But if it doesn't happen in their physics class or their chemistry class or the mechanical engineering class, they're not getting the practice. So I would like you all to comment on where the place of it is in undergraduate and graduate education.
For quick clarification, is it pushback from the students themselves or from?
I'm here to be a scientist.
Yeah.
Right.
I'll take a really quick answer to this. So you can probably imagine what it was like for me to walk into a thermodynamics upper level undergraduate course and say, hey, everybody, this week, you material scientists are going to tell true personal stories about thermodynamics. There was just like 30 blank faces. And then the professor said, and you're going to be graded on this. It went over like a ton of bricks. But what was fascinating was we gave them the assignment of tell a true personal story about a time thermodynamics happened, thinking that they would talk about, I don't know, setting things on fire or crashing their cars. We ended up getting stories of addiction, PTSD. We saw this sort of fascinating break where some of the engineers were using the metaphor spaces of technical concepts they were learning, like equilibrium, dynamic equilibrium, as a metaphor for the things they were going through in their lives. And then other people were telling stories about how they got from supporting US troops because he's an Iraqi translator to having PTSD flashbacks in this lab in Boise. And so there was a lot of work that we had to do to explain why we were trying to build these soft skills. And the arguments that the professor and I were making together, this is Dr. Eric Jankowski at Boise State, where you need to perform in interviews. People want to know, are you going to be a functional member of this team? You need to be able to make the case that you have value, you understand what you are. And we were also we were studying whether articulating how they see the world helps actually determine career trajectories. That self-authorship of saying, I'm an engineer because I see the world this way, is an incredibly powerful identification tool in that same way.
Yeah, so something that I was thinking about is using the exercise of telling a story to help break some of the, the misconceptions that scientists, when I'll talk about my own experience, like I stumbled upon science communication and storytelling, and I very much, as an undergraduate specifically, I thought, I'm a single track, it's all about the science, it's all about the math. I don't care about the humanities, who care about the psychology? Like, none of those things mattered in my mind. And of course, now I know I was so wrong. And so when I work with scientists, I get the same resistance. It's like, well, it's not about emotions, it's about my science, it's about that protein that has this name that I can't pronounce, or maybe only 3 people in the world can pronounce off the top of their head. And using the exercise of storytelling to kind of break that down and show them how it's actually better, how they can actually use that to connect the science or the data or the facts that they want to actually communicate. Have them do the experiment of saying something with all of the jargon and numbers that they want, and then have them do this telling a story and have them feel that one of the things that I see is that you can tell scientists, or anyone for that matter, about the wonders and the power of communication and storytelling, but it's not until they experience that power then they're like, oh, now I get it. So how can you get them to experience that by breaking down that resistance?
There's another piece to the experience of it, which is the incentive system for learning how to do that. A grade is one, but for example, if they believe that the best way to get published is to write first-person invisible articles in which everything is and, that's what they'll do. But if they come to see that the great papers in science are stories, they have the structure of, we thought this, but then this happened, so then we did something else. Those are the classic great papers, and those are what the best publications are highlighting. So for them to understand that to excel in their own fields, mastering storytelling within the context of science is rewarded.
I agree with what all of you are saying, but you seem to be talking about something that came about after you finished your education. And I'm just wondering, what is the place of it in the current education system?
I think there's a lot of, there's a lot of material to cover today, and it gets more and more and more. The engineering curriculum, now they're talking about making that 5 years for undergraduates because there's just too much to know, and it's all, if you know this, then you have to know this to do that, and that to do this, and this to, So students are often frantic about getting all that information, and they don't see the point of the story. I think what you just said obviously illustrates the point. So I think, there are balancing values here. There's only so many hours in the day. I totally agree. A real education at a real university has got to involve the humanities and the sciences and seeing the connection between it. And we shouldn't lose those values in a fast-paced, kind of increasingly shallow world, right? We shouldn't give up on those things. I have a little empathy, though, for the students because there's so much they have to know. So we have to balance that, and we have to reassure them. We're going to cover the things you need to know, and this will help you. This will be a tool that you can use that's empowering. By the way, the other thing, too, is I think there's a true value in science about not being ad hominem, which tends to be overgeneralized, meaning that you don't want to make it about individual. It doesn't matter, who it was who came up with the discovery. Real science is about, it's the subjective thing. Anyone, the student can tell the professor they're wrong because they were right because they have the data, right? Real science is about that. It's not about the people. So there's a good side to that. It's not about people's motives. That's ad hominem. It's about the facts and the real, the methods and that sort of thing. And anybody can excel because it's about, did you do it right? And objectively, we can evaluate it. But we lose the heart part of it too. And that's part of life too. So integrating those two, seeing the value of the traditional scientific approach, there's a value to that, right? And seeing the value, however, of the other side of the coin, which you've all talked about.
And yeah, and just to kind of echo what everyone else has said, because I've run into the exact same problem teaching medical students and in terms of narrative approaches. And what's really interesting is maybe because they're going into medicine, they will pay lip service to the value of, say, listening to the patient's story, right? But then to require a course in which they actually study that, there's tremendous pushback. And why? Because I think it's really a systemic issue. I don't think it has to do with the personality of the scientist or the future physician. I think it's because the educational system itself hasn't really committed to saying this has value. They may say it has value, but for example, medical students, nothing that I would teach them would ever show up on the exams that are going to determine their fate in terms of future residencies. So I think until that changes, we're asking a lot of students, and I think in the interim, the idea of testimonials trying to elicit why this is actually going to be beneficial to those students, how this will help them advance their careers, both strategically in terms of getting internships or whatever, and in terms of their own thinking as future scientists. But it's hard to
we have
do
a question.
Hi, Natalie Snyder with Environmental Defense Fund. My question is about the balance between telling a story that's compelling, gets a lot of clicks, versus the sensationalized storytelling, which a lot of times is used in misinformation. So how do you balance telling a compelling story versus being sensationalized? And then how do you counter a sensationalized misinformation story with a story that's compelling?
Well, I mean, I think like one of the things that what we try to do in this film is not to, people say, well, what do you think? And we try not to be very didactic or be sort of press people towards a certain type of outcome. And I said earlier that the audience is smarter than we think, and I really do think they are. I mean, we heard a lot of feedback, like just thank you that this wasn't a polemic. Thank you for trusting our own intelligence, letting us try to figure it out. And so I really do think, again, that we believe in, there's, of course, sensationalist stories get a lot of clicks, but, I don't know whether we're, is that not just the subject matter, but the way that they're told, the way that the pictures are being used, the way the headlines are being written, the way they're appearing in people's social media feeds. And so I really do think that there is, I mean, maybe we'll be proven wrong, but I don't think we've given a shot yet for trying to imagine new storytelling devices that are more nuanced and seeing whether there's more of an audience for that. I mean, I think that you've seen in certain sectors like podcasts, which is where the barriers to entry are a little lower in terms of the cost. You've seen an explosion of very thoughtful, creative subject matter that's reaching wonderfully wide audiences, and that people are engaging with that at length. You're seeing, very in-depth documentary film series that people are watching hour after hour, and this idea of a short attention span. So I do think that sometimes people just want to click through their Twitter feed, and other times they want to sit down and watch something for 4 hours or listen to it. And so I think that it's going to take, again, putting more out there and really trying to see, and trying to experiment with how we're telling it. We can't just do it the same way we've always done it and say, look, this is a dry article, but people should do it because that's what the facts are. But we should be thinking about storytelling devices that are engaging, but yet still aren't just about sensationalistic.
I think that is a very complex and dangerous continuum. And I think a lot of it is because in the scientific domain, scientific knowledge has authority. It is the best knowledge we have about this. It gets to the heart, as you were talking. And so it's got authority. As soon as we move that into the storytelling domain, science loses its advantage. You can say, oh, it's credible, this is correct. But then they can say, yeah, but the black market organ donation storyline, that's a better story. We're going that direction. And I think the fear, or maybe the reaction, is that now that it's an even playing field, do scientists, how far do they go to try and do the same things to compete with people who have no restriction to make anything accurate?
And I would just like to add as a small footnote, every one of you in this room has a role to play in exactly this issue. Committing to quality, committing to accuracy is not always the most popular thing, but it takes the personal commitment of people like you to make a difference.
Great. We have time for one more question.
So it's interesting how the conversation has mostly focused on storytelling as some sort of alternative to science communication, as like an other thing. But I think Marty sort of touched on this very briefly, but I really would like to come back to it, that I think scientists are extremely adept at telling stories to each other. And we do this in the form of scientific publications. I mean, if you read a typical quantitative social science paper, and you just look at the regression tables, right, which is sort of mostly, there's sort of 20 pages of introduction, and then there's the results section, and you get the regression coefficients, and then there's another 10 pages of conclusions and implications and interpretations. Like, the results themselves are, first of all, tell you very little on their own, and secondly, are not the gist of the article. It's not what you get. That is not the conclusion to which the reader is being sort of carefully led by the author. It's storytelling. And not only is that something that we do, we have to do it. I mean, as those of us who have submitted papers and had them rejected from leading journals are familiar, the reason is not like your research was unsound or whatever. It's basically you didn't tell a good enough story. Like, you didn't sell things well enough. And I think the fact that we do not admit that that's what we're doing, that we sort of say things like, oh, storytelling, that's for not, we're scientists, bullshit. We are telling stories all the time. And the fact that we don't admit it, I think, is extremely dangerous for us, because, we sort of are worried about the replication crisis. I think this is a bigger shoe that's going to drop, is that we're all drawing conclusions from our data and from our analyses that are actually not supported by the evidence, because that's what our editors, that's what our readers, that's what our peers actually resonate with, for all the same reasons that you've been articulating. So I wonder, like, what can we do just to highlight this problem, to analyze it?
The essence of science is dramatic. It's all about conflict. It's about the overturning of the old with the next, the better. And that conflict is what science is. And so it's not a dereliction of duty to take advantage of the inherent narrative in the scientific process in the telling of that story.
It may contradict with the other objective of science, which is to use predictably accurate.
I don't think so.
I think, that verbatim just, if you think, verbatim is the just the facts, no interpretation, exactly what objectively happened, right? But you have to always go beyond that. You have to always interpret the facts. And it's always a question of, and someday we're going to prove that whatever we're saying here is all wrong too, right? That'll be progress. And that we'll go beyond the data then too. And will we ever get to the end of knowledge? I don't know. But right now, I know that there's plenty that we don't know. So you always go beyond the facts. And the question is, you have to describe, here are the data, so that you can disagree. So if I report the data and you say, no, you've left out a really important empirically supported counter-explanation, then that's the next paper. And so I think of, I worry about a little bit about the replication crisis, because I think the way that this is adjudicated is the combat between ideas, so that we're a community of scholars. So we're all commenting and criticizing. We're all going beyond the data to some degree. We're making it as objective as possible. We're operationalizing our variables, all of that good scientific solid stuff. But in the end, we really are interpreting.
I will bring us to a close by saying I was struggling initially to understand and come up with a tight definition of narrative. And where I've landed is that stories, in our sense, are believable characters experiencing non-trivial events linked by profound causality. And I think that stories, searching for the truthfulness, that's what makes a story tight, is that there's a strong linkage between cause and effect, actions, reactions, consequences. And I think science is searching for the same thing. What is the true cause or the underlying processes that create these patterns that we're looking at? So I have happy news for all of you. We are taking a slight change to the schedule. we will take a 15-minute break. So please be back here in your seats at 4:15. And thank you again very much to all of you panelists.